Picture a silent stadium for a second. The lights are dim, the air is stale, and you're in the crowd, just holding your breath. Then a team of cadets marches out. But they aren't just walking, they're gliding across the floor.
Right, it's that locked-in precision.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, in a split second, just snap.
Yeah.
12 rifles spin into the air, they catch the spotlight, rotate 3 times, and land in perfect unison. It looks flawless.
Yeah.
I mean, to anyone watching, it looks like the absolute peak of military discipline.
It creates an incredibly powerful image. It screams control and unity. It's the kind of thing that makes you stop scrolling and just watch.
It really does. But here is the twist. According to the white paper we were unpacking today, that image might be a total illusion. Beneath that shiny, synchronized surface, the world of exhibition drill is apparently just, well, it's the Wild West.
Yeah, that's exactly the term for it.
We're talking about an activity that is largely unregulated, potentially dangerous, and honestly facing a massive identity crisis right now.
It is a classic case of a tradition just completely outgrowing its rules. For this deep dive, we are looking at a document titled Exhibition Drill Standards Risk Institutional Value and Strategic Action.
Catchy title.
Right, very formal. It's written by someone known as the Drill Master. And let's be clear right off the bat, this isn't just some casual blog post critiquing how teenagers spin rifles. It is written as a command decision memorandum.
Which means it's a strategic guide.
Exactly. It's designed for senior leaders, colonels, generals, school superintendents, people making high-level calls.
That sounds incredibly serious for what, honestly, I always thought was just a cool extracurricular activity.
It is serious. The core argument here is that exhibition drill has evolved into a high-impact performance discipline, but it is still being treated by the powers that be like an informal backyard hobby. And the author argues that gap between the reality of the performance and the lack of oversight is genuinely dangerous.
And a risky hobby at that. I mean, going through the source material, it uses some surprisingly intense language. I found myself highlighting words like liability, institutional risk, and unregulated spectacle.
Those are the exact phrases that jump out.
So our mission today is to figure out how to take this chaos and turn it into what the author calls a strategic institutional asset.
Which is really just a fancy military way of asking, how do we stop just throwing heavy metal objects in the air and start actually building leaders?
I love that framing. But before we get into the danger and the drama of it all, we need to define our terms. Because I think for a lot of people listening, and honestly, for me too, before I dug into this drill, just means marching in a straight line. But the white paper is very specific about what this is, and maybe more importantly, what it isn't.
Yeah, this is the taxonomy problem, and it's where all the confusion starts. The source makes it crystal clear. Exhibition drill is not regulation drill. Regulation drill is about doctrinal compliance. That's everyone moving on specific barked commands, looking exactly the same, purely for the purpose of moving troops from point A to point B efficiently. It's robotic in the best possible way.
Okay, so that's the standard marching we see in movies. Basic training stuff.
Right, exactly. It is also not ceremonial drill, which is what you see at funerals or solemn parades. Very slow, very respectful. And it is not color guard, which is strictly about flag protocol and national honor.
So if it isn't any of those things, if it's not moving troops and it's not a funeral, what actually is it?
The author defines it as a competitive military performance discipline. The key phrase to remember there is structured creative expression. It allows for creativity, but that creativity has to exist strictly within military parameters.
That feels like a contradiction, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, usually military means do exactly what you're told, and creativity means do whatever you feel.
And that tension is exactly where the discipline lives. That is the magic of it. The source frames the drill deck not just as a gymnasium floor you march on, but as a performance environment. It talks heavily about visual communication.
So they're speaking without speaking.
Yes. The performers are using movement, equipment manipulation, and spacing as a language. They are trying to convey intensity, professionalism, and power directly to an audience.
That's almost like military theater.
In a way, yeah. But with a very strict dress code and heavy, demilitarized weapons. It's performance art, but the medium is absolute military precision. The stage has defined geography, and the performers have to use that space to tell a story without saying a single word.
Okay, so we have this performance discipline. It sounds great in theory, but the white paper argues that right now, the reality doesn't match that definition at all. You mentioned the Wild West earlier. What is actually happening out there on the drill deck that has the drill master so concerned?
The source identifies what it calls a systemic deficiency. Basically, because there is no single governing body setting the rules for the entire country, like you have the NFL for football or the NBA for basketball, everything is totally fragmented.
Everyone is making up their own rules.
Exactly. You have inconsistent definitions, judges who aren't formally trained, and rules that literally change from competition to competition.
That sounds like an absolute nightmare for a competitor. You could win one week and lose the next doing the exact same routine just because the rules change.
It is a nightmare. And this fragmentation leads to what the paper calls the drift towards spectacle.
Drift towards spectacle. I love that phrase, but it sounds kind of ominous, like we're drifting out to sea and losing sight of land.
It is ominous if you care about the integrity of the sport. This drift towards spectacle means that competitions are starting to reward novelty, speed, and shock value over actual execution quality. Teams are trying to be louder, faster, and riskier just to get a visceral reaction from the crowd rather than focusing on their technique.
This is where we get to the flying rifle problem, right?
Exactly. The source calls it motion without meaning. You see routines that are just chaotic, a flurry of movement and spinning weapons. They are throwing the rifles higher and higher, spinning them faster and faster, but there's no underlying structure. It's just noise.
Like an action movie with nothing but explosions and zero plot.
That is the perfect analogy.
And this isn't just about bad aesthetics or making a bad movie. This is where the peril really comes in. We aren't just talking about getting a low score from a judge. We're talking about actual safety.
The white paper is very blunt about this. It warns of increased injury probability due to inadequate equipment control. If you encourage kids to throw heavy, demilitarized rifles, which, keep in mind, are essentially 8 to 10 pounds of solid wood and steel 10 feet in the air without proper training standards, people are going to get hurt.
And I imagine that keeps school principals and unit commanders up at night, or at least it should.
It absolutely should. This is the institutional risk assessment part of the document. If a program is sponsored by a high school or a military unit, and they are allowing reckless difficulty, that's the exact term used, they are exposing themselves to massive legal and insurance risks.
Reckless difficulty. That's a strong term. It sounds like a traffic violation you'd get on the highway.
It fits perfectly, though. The source argues that if you don't regulate this, you are sitting on a ticking time bomb. If a cadet gouges their eye out or drops a rifle into the bleachers because they were trying a trick they weren't trained for, that is a huge liability. And beyond the lawsuit, it damages the reputation of the service branch represented on that uniform.
It's interesting because the paper positions this entirely as a failure of leadership. If you let the activity drift into spectacle, you aren't just making bad art, you're failing to protect your people.
That's the crux of it. It's an abdication of command responsibility, and that pivots us to the solution. The drill master doesn't just complain about the chaos, he proposes a rigid framework to fix it. It starts with something called the doctrine of intention.
I have to say, this was my favorite part of the reading. The doctrine of intention. It sounds so philosophical, like we're in a Zen garden instead of a drill meet. What does that actually mean in praxis?
It is philosophical, but it's deeply practical on the deck. The core idea is that every single movement must have a defensible purpose. You don't just move your arm because you have nothing else to do. You don't just spin the rifle because you're bored. Every step, every spin, every pause must be there for a clear reason.
It reminds me of good writing or editing. If a sentence doesn't move the story forward, you cut it. Or, in architecture, form follows function.
That is spot on. The source explicitly talks about performance architecture. A routine isn't just a grocery list of tricks. Okay, I'll do the over-the-head spin, then the leg slap, then the huge toss.
Like just checking boxes.
Exactly. You can't just trick boxes. It needs an introduction, a development, a climax, and a resolution. It needs to tell a visual story with a distinct beginning, middle, and end.
So you really can't just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. You have to build it intentionally.
You have to design it. And within that design, there's this really counterintuitive detail about stillness. The paper argues that stopping just being entirely still is actually a functional design element.
Wait, how is doing nothing a design element? Isn't the whole point of a drill routine to move?
Think about the world we live in right now. It's constant stimulation, TikTok speed. We think we have to keep moving to keep someone's attention. But the expert argues that stillness creates necessary contrast. It allows the audience to actually process what they just saw. If you go 100 miles per hour the whole time, the audience gets visual fatigue. They literally stop seeing the details.
That makes a lot of sense. It's exactly like music. If it's just a wall of sound with absolutely no breaks, it's exhausting to listen to. You need the rests, the silence to make the loud notes actually matter.
Precisely. It's called temporal architecture managing time. You can't just sprint a marathon. You have to pace the routine to manage the audience's attention and, frankly, the performer's physical endurance. If a cadet is gasping for air halfway through because they haven't paused, their execution is going to completely fall apart.
So we have the architecture of the routine, the pacing, the stillness, the intention. But what about the actual handling of the rifle? We talked about those flying rifles earlier, but how should they be handled? The white paper introduces this concept of movement authority.
Movement authority. I think this is a concept that applies to overall leadership just as much as it applies to drill.
It sounds like you need a special license to spin.
In a way, you should. Movement authority means it's not enough to just attempt a difficult trick. You have to demonstrate technical legitimacy. You need to look like you absolute own the weapon. You shouldn't look like you're fighting it or chasing it across the floor or just praying it lands in your hand.
This brings up a huge issue in how these things are scored, though, because looking like you own it feels a bit subjective. If I'm a judge and I see Cadet A do a crazy triple backflip throw, but they catch it sloppily, and Cadet B does a simple standard toss, but catches it perfectly, who wins?
That is the eternal question, and it's exactly where the Wild West environment creates major problems. The paper distinguishes heavily between what you do and how you do it, content versus execution.
Break that down for us a bit more.
Sure, content is the what. That's the difficulty, the design, the raw complexity of the move you wrote. Execution is the how. The precision, the control, the polish, the body posture while you do it. The trap a lot of teams fall into, and honestly a lot of untrained judges fall into, is thinking that high difficulty automatically equals a high score.
Right, the mindset of, I threw it higher, so I'm clearly better. I risked more, so I win.
But the source explicitly warns against that. Difficulty alone does not equate to excellence. A high difficulty move done poorly, maybe with a wobble or a bad catch or slumped posture, should score lower than a moderate move done perfectly.
That seems like a really hard sell for a teenager who just wants to look cool and impress their friends in the bleachers.
It is an incredibly hard sell. That's why the judging criteria absolutely need to be fixed to reinforce it from the top down. The principle here is earned excellence. True effect comes from confidence and clean execution, not just the danger factor. If the audience is scared you're going to drop it or they're flinching because you look out of control, you've lost the effect. You've lost that movement authority.
Okay, let's unpack the human side of this equation. Because beneath the rifles and the sharp uniforms, we're talking about young people developing skills. The source calls exhibition drill a leadership laboratory. Now that sounds great on a recruitment brochure, but how does spinning a piece of wood actually teach leadership?
It moves way beyond the physical moves. The source argues that this activity creates intense peer-to-peer responsibility. Think about a tandem routine where two people are spinning right at each other, or a squad of four. If you are out of step, or if you drop your rifle, you don't just fail yourself, you break the image for the entire team.
So the stakes are completely shared. You can't hide in the back row.
Exactly. It forces you to hold each other accountable in real time. It builds command presence, that ability to stand in front of a critical crowd, stand up straight, and project total confidence even when you're terrified inside. And unlike a written history test, you can't fake it. You either have the physical skill and the composure, or you don't.
But there's a gap here too, isn't there? We talked about the kids, but what about the people actually teaching them? A leadership laboratory needs a qualified professor.
A massive gap. The specific finding in the paper is insufficient coach qualification.
Which sounds very polite and bureaucratic, but what does it actually mean in the real world?
It basically means a lot of these coaches are just former cadets themselves. They know how to spin because they did it in high school 5 years ago, but they don't actually know how to teach. They lack technical or design literacy. They rely entirely on informal tradition, doing what they saw their older brother do, rather than using safe, proven pedagogical methods.
So they're teaching the what, but they don't understand the how or the why. They're just copying old YouTube videos of winning routines.
Right. And if you don't understand the how, you cannot troubleshoot safety issues. You don't know the actual biomechanics of a complex toss. The white paper argues that professionalization requires formal training pipelines for coaches. They need to understand pedagogy, how to teach skills progressively so kids don't get hurt trying things they aren't ready for.
It sounds like a deep ethical obligation.
It absolutely is. They have an ethical obligation to prioritize participant safety over winning a plastic trophy on a Saturday. You can't build leaders if you're physically breaking them or teaching them that looking cool matters more than doing things right.
This feels like where the rubber really meets the road. You can't have a professional sport with amateur leadership.
Correct. And you can't have a professional sport with amateur referees either, which leads us straight to the governance section.
The boring but necessary stuff. Adjudication.
It is only boring until you lose a national championship because a judge didn't like your background music or because they just didn't get your routine.
Fair point. Nothing hurts more than a loss that feels completely random.
Exactly. To fix that, the source calls for caption-based scoring.
Help us understand that mechanism. How is that different from what happens out there now?
Currently, in the Wild West model, a judge might just look at a 3-minute routine and say, that was cool, 8 out of 10. It's holistic, but it's incredibly vague. Caption-based scoring breaks it down into distinct categories. You score composition entirely separate from equipment handling. You score movement separately from general effect.
So a team could be phenomenal at marching and spatial movement, but terrible at actual rifle handling. And the score would reflect that specific breakdown.
Exactly. It creates total transparency. It tells the team exactly where they need to improve. It says, your design was great, but your hands were messy. And along with that structural change, the white paper demands intellectual accountability from the judges themselves.
Intellectual accountability. I
Yeah.
really like that term. It sounds like you can't just go on vibes anymore.
You absolutely cannot go on vibes. A judge needs to provide concrete, evidence-based reasons for every score they give. They can't just rely on personal preference or regional bias. If you give a team a low score, you need to point to the specific technical or design flaw that justified it, saying, I gave you a 6 because your spacing intervals were inconsistent, rather than I gave you a 6 because I didn't like your attitude.
It forces the judge to be as professional and disciplined as the performers on the deck. It elevates the whole ecosystem.
Which brings us right back to the strategic level, the command decision memorandum aspect. This whole document is ultimately a pitch to the people in charge.
Right. Because if I'm a commander or a school principal or a district superintendent listening to this, why do I care? Why should I put money, time, and effort into professionalizing this weird niche sport, have a budget to balance, and a million other problems?
The answer is institutional value. You and I can see the connection now. A well-run, regulated program improves recruitment metrics. It improves student retention. If parents and the broader community see a disciplined, sharp, incredibly professional drill team representing the school, public trust in that institution goes way up.
It makes it look like the organization really has its act together. It projects total competence.
Exactly. But on the flip side, what if they see a messy, dangerous, chaotic spectacle? What if they see kids dropping weapons and running around looking out of control?
Then it becomes a massive liability. It damages the brand of the school or the military branch. It looks like the inmates are running the asylum.
Precisely. The source argues that you can turn a potential liability like injured cadets and messy performances into a strategic institutional asset. But you have to actively choose to regulate it. You have to invest in the standards. It won't happen on its own.
It really is a binary choice between a backyard hobby and a true discipline.
That is the core conflict of the paper, the command-level decision points. Leaders have to decide right now, will we treat this as a regulated discipline with rigorous standards, or will we leave it as a risky, informal hobby? And the underlying implication is that leaving it as a hobby is no longer a viable option if you actually care about safety and institutional reputation.
And building on all of that, there's a really profound point here about the message we're sending to these future leaders. If we let them think that spectacle and danger are more important than precision and safety, what kind of leaders are we actually building for tomorrow?
That is exactly the cultural risk.
And it ties into a really provocative thought about command presence that the source uses to wrap this all up. It asks a really hard question. If we demand absolute precision in regulation drill, where every button is buttoned, every heel strikes the ground at the exact same millisecond, and we demand absolute precision in combat training, where lives are actually on the line,
Why have we accepted complete chaos and unregulated spectacle in exhibition drill?
it's a glaring double standard.
It is. It suggests we just don't value the activity enough to hold it to the same standard as everything else we do. Closing that gap is the only path to professionalization.
Yeah.
If we want these cadets to be the future leaders of our institutions, we have to treat their training environment with the deep respect it deserves.
It really completely changes how you look at a drill team. I know that next time you see those rifles spinning in the air, you won't just be looking at the height of the toss. You'll be looking for the intention, the structure, the movement authority, and the safety.
You'll be looking for the hidden architecture behind the spectacle.
And I think that is exactly where we will leave it for this deep dive. Whether you're a commander looking at your budget, a coach on the floor, or just someone who appreciates seeing absolute precision in motion, there's clearly a lot more to this than meets the eye. Thanks for taking the time to explore this with us.
Remember, every movement matters. Stay sharp out there.